In terms of this evening, as it's for William, or Bill Majors, as I always called him, I like his last name because he was a major artist. Whether that got known before or not, that's something else, but he was. And the way we met was very spontaneous, because I was on my first visit to New York in 1963, coming from Los Angeles. I'd taken a train trip across the country with a fellow artist named Daniel LaRue Johnson, who was a very fine Afro-American artist, one of the first of our generation to have a major work at the Museum of Modern Art in 1960 or the late 50s. I'm not sure the exact year. But what I'm getting at is we as artists came across the country together. I stopped in Houston and saw my family. We hooked up after that and came on to New York. And of course I was going to see the Museum of Modern Art. I was going to go to the Whitney, those things. And somewhere in there I heard that artists, guards at the Museum of Modern Art were artists. And somewhere, I think it was the third floor, as I came up a stair there, and I saw this guard. Well, he wasn't quite like the other guards, because he was just cool. Absolutely. And he did have on his dark glasses, you know. And I walked up to him and I said, "Hey man, are you an artist?" And he said, "What?" He says, "Everybody comes up here and they ask me, where's Guernica? Where's the Calder? Where's this? Where's that? And you ask me, am I an artist?" I said, "Well, that's what I heard. Some of your guys were artists." He said, "Well, yeah, I am." And from that moment on, I didn't move to New York until a process that took 1966, an actual move in 67. But I would go to the place that Bill had on 7th Avenue and 30th Street. And that's where I met Romare Bidden, Norman Lewis, and Ernest Critchlow, Earl Miller, any number of other artists. I don't remember the whole set of numbers. I also was introduced to Tanqueray and Tonic, who were very important art mediums. So when you discuss etching and its processes, there was some stuff going on that was very good. Also the lime juice. The Tanqueray bottle was green, and the lime juice from the place downstairs. That place.
That's right, the
and
corner.
There was a cello in the place, and there was a pretty young lady hanging around at the same time. I don't know what she was doing, but it turned out to be art. You know? No, and I say that way because Susan's personality there was very informative and very helpful, you know, as I remember. And in that period, well, knowing Bill just grew through the years, you know, any number of people. Anthony Panzera, who we're going to squeeze and make him come up here in a bit. We taught at Orange County Community College. Well, we were there, at least I was, certainly because of Bill's influence, and I needed a job, and it worked out that way. So Panzera and I often commuted from New York up to Middletown in Orange County. I could go on and on as a personal monologue, because when you bring up Bill, for me, he's so important in that aspect in my life, and any number of aesthetic and useful ideas of how do you negotiate this world, being an artist and being really one of quality and other things, you know. I'd even say he kind of made me sure I dressed right. He wouldn't appreciate the shoes I'm wearing tonight because he just wouldn't have showed up here with this quality of stuff. The blazer, he could hang with that. But I'm just trying to say we influenced each other in very subtle but important ways. And all of it was humanistic, you know. And, you know, I don't know, he just was a part of everything. Susan, I better give it back to you because I'll go on and on and on.
That's the idea, isn't it? Isn't it? Well, yeah, because this does interlace with our story, our friendship a lot.
Exactly.
A lot.
Exactly. Yeah.
Because I'm going to throw in a little anecdote of that. So it's the mid '60s, and you're coming back and forth to New York, and then you come up to the 7th floor, and I'm working there at MoMA. And you say, where's this guy? Because you lost track of him. So somebody said, well, she'll know. So that's how some of these things happened. And then you arrive with your family and your daughters.
Who are, how do you call it? A bit more mature now, after 40 years. Or is it 50?
So it's all part of our lives, and the trips up to Middletown, Orange County Community College, and so on. Yeah, we had the frequency of our seeing each other was unfortunately a little less, because in the 1970s, Majors Bill and I moved to New Hampshire, unfortunately, after also being on the West Coast and so on. But to the point. But the closeness of our staying in touch through all these years has been really, really vital for us.
Postcards from you from all kinds of places.
Well, actually, I have a postcard, speaking of it, with me today from 1975. It's a very telling postcard. So, but briefly, this is the kind of exchange in which you were actually, you both had been sharing your mutual recognition of mutual support. Let's put it that way, which clearly was very, very important in the friendship. Right. Essential for Bill, you and Norman Lewis. And a lot of, often staying in touch with other artists, such as Anthony Panzera, who is here today. So I actually have the benefit of some questions that Alan Edmonds sort of slipped to me. And
he's very subtle, you know.
Yeah, he is. So I think I'm going to refer to a few of those. Not that I don't have my own ideas, but you've already talked about meeting and connecting with Majors. And I think that one of the things that can't paraphrase, but it touches upon something that Alan and I talked about a little bit earlier when we had an interview here about 2 hours ago, is the environment in New York at the time, and how we don't have to so elaborately talk about how different it is today or not. So much as to say that it was a time where, sure, people could be competitive and so on, but there are plenty of occasions where artists were mutually supportive. And I think that's of value to understand. It's part of the mentoring that also happens between generations. It's informal, it's spontaneous, but would you like to talk a little bit about that?
I guess I could. When you have a lot of years behind you in relation to these kind of things, or the whole thing, you realize that a lot of it, in terms of the basic circumstances, what kind of society we live in. And we have to, or at least I have to always remember and remind myself, it's a mercantile society. They talk about in constitutional terms that it's created for this reason or that reason. But primarily it's a mercantile society developed as a colonial experiment or enterprise, multiple in fact. And how does that fit with the 1960s? Well, the generation that was older than me were young artists during the Depression. So they understood, the frailties of this society that we live in. But they made art all the way through it. They worked out ways of doing collaborative things. They worked out ways of, if you will, using the realities of the world as subject matter. They were local, they were regional, they were international. If I met Romare Bearden in a major studio, I met Norman Lewis there, Well, this was kind of a local version. But even then, Norman's family was from Barbados, Romy's family was from North Carolina. And I was just in Pittsburgh back in September doing a talk, and there was a dinner afterwards, and the lady asked me, was I aware that Romare had worked and lived in Pittsburgh? And I was aware of it, because one of the things that came in parallels experiences with going to the studio of Majors on 30th Street and 7th Avenue was stops at Romare's studio on Canal Street. And I lived about 4 blocks away on Canal Street. Yeah. And this is the late 60s. And Norman Lewis moved to Grand Street in that same period. And in fact, one day, because my place I can't call it a studio because it was a funny, incorrect storefront, but it was functional, which artists always managed to make do. But what I'm getting at is we had to walk to Grand Union if we were going to do shopping, and it was about a 12-block walk. And one day I was walking with my daughter, who was about 8 years old then, and Norman Lewis is standing outside smoking a cigarette, which he shouldn't have been doing, And I say it that way because eventually cigarettes got to be a part of his demise. And the reason I say it is because I got asked to sit with him when he was very ill in the same place, a couple years later. But at this time, Norman was standing there, and he was grumpy and complaining. And I said, what's the matter? He says, well, I'm trying to get this goddamn mosaic to stick in the ceiling, and it won't. So I, broke off, and we went upstairs, and we managed to make it work, And I didn't see that mosaic again until about 6 or 7 years later, after Norman had passed, and Ouida was having a reception in relation to his work. And I had to go to the bathroom, the restroom. And I happened to see the mosaic in the ceiling, and that just reminded me. In other words, we were regular people assisting people in very ordinary ways. At the same time, of course, Norman's work, I'd not seen work with that kind of subtlety, dealing with the kind of abstraction based on human events. And so it was very unusual work, and I was privileged to see it, and to get to know him. Mm. And I'm going to give you a Norman Lewis proverb. They all spoke them, and you might want to call it a proverb after I give it to you. But basically, he said to me in a discussion between us where I was talking too much, something like this. But he said, "Shut up, you fuck, you can't hear with your mouth open." Okay, what that did for me, you might not expect, but this is a kind of exchange. Years later, I made a sculpture dedicated to Norman Lewis. And one of the kind of works that I make, they're kinetic in that they rock. But I made one unit that rocked and one that didn't rock. In other words, one that was shutting up, if you will. But it was a contrast in thinking, but informative, because Norman's work, like Romare, like Bill's, all of them, everybody was thinking deeply about the principles in the work, not just the subject and then a quasi-illustration of the subject, but how you develop and take something beyond. If it were music, I suppose you'd call it theme and variations. And I'd say theme and variation, and then that variation is a theme. And then another theme develops, and you don't recognize where it came from by the time you get through with it. But this kind of thinking was there. It's been a part of my thinking all along, so I recognize when other people had aspects of it. So when people see that procession process in Norman's paintings, when you see Bill's etchings and the kind of subtleties in there, you know. The interest in what had been, you know, I can see from Goya to Gorky seeing majors, because it's in the quality of dynamics that an aware artist of the 20th century has the possibility of understanding, you know. Everybody doesn't, that's all right, because there's something different for each person, and it is kind of like our voices. And Bill's voice is unique, you know, and that's why I'm very glad to see it here, to see it in a place that's significantly concerned with that aspect, the printmaking. And of course, the portfolio of Bill's from Ecclesiastes. And you could say this is, I won't call it a textbook, but it's, well, whatever Bibles and things like that are for religion, it has that capacity, that potential, if you spend the time to be able to understand what it took to make those prints. And I'm not, I made prints through the years courtesy of people like Bill. Bob Blackburn, who I like to call the grandfather of it all, so to speak.
Yeah.
Alan, Curly Holton, the late Ben Wigfall, you know. Every one of them I managed to get in one relationship, one print or something like that with. And a few other situations. Connor Everts in Los Angeles was maybe the first printmaker that on post-school days experience with printmaking. And yet I was then still a painter and not quite formed as a sculptor, but starting to be. And anyway, I just saw in Bill, given his history, that is from Indianapolis to Cleveland, he really mesmerized me, talking about spending a year or however long it was in Italy, because, you know, one of the underground dreams of most artists in the United States, especially in that era, was you got to spend some time, somehow you got to find a way to be in Europe for a while. And that's supposed to give you something special. And it did help Bill very much, you know. And it just shows that if you go anywhere in the world, because it's not limited to Europe, and in my own experience, it's taken me all over the world, and I've seen people who make great art everywhere. And I don't believe in the supremacy of the United States or the Western world. People have made great art for thousands of years all over the world, everywhere, for their own reasons. And just like, and Bill, he was making his for his reasons, you know. And you have to get to know him. Maybe if you're, I'm presuming everybody here is also from somewhere else, you know. And I say that because if Bill was in Indianapolis, I had 5 years in Ohio when I was a 7 to 12-year-old. Well, that probably was no more than 100 miles apart from Dayton to Indianapolis. No, only passed through there heading back to Texas when, you know, my family. But what I'm getting at, there was something everywhere because there were people willing to explore. And Bill explored, and he explored within the work, but he also saw the world. And if you look at the work, really spend time, you find that in it, you know. Is that enough for question number one? No, but yeah, Bill is that, I'm quick, but Bill is literally worth that much discussion and much more. It's just a matter of, you know.
Yeah, I'll pick up on that point about the discussion about his work, because he was a painter, and he just drew like hell, and drawing was really, really important. Alan and Gustavo and I were talking about that, but looking at this work, looking at the collage. But Anthony Panzera, and I have had those conversations through the years. In fact, Anthony, who's here, when he was at Hunter College, teaching, organized an exhibition about Bill Major's drawings called Distinctions. So what I'm getting to is about working in with different materials, exploring, investigating different media. So Majors is a painter. He draws. He really sunk his teeth into etching as late as 1962. And for the next 20 years, he devoted a lot of effort, time and thought and dedication to that, which we see here. And collage and more paintings and occasionally carving. This little, just a quick aside, this little postcard I have from you, he's asked you in this, and you're responding, he says, he wanted to know where to cast some of his sculpture in wax, and you responded, said you didn't know where to find it. You couldn't help him on that, but anyway, it's okay.
Now I could, if you still got it, we could do it. Yeah.
And that was 1975. So working in different materials, as you do. I mean, all of the artists we're talking about, some more than others, explored various media, and what I'd like to, this is my particular bias about talking about Bill's work, is to say that this concurrently, simultaneously, he was always working in several media, and the interplay was really important.
Sure.
So you may have seen some of that happening in the studio.
I would say this, I didn't see as much of it. I mean, I saw paintings, prints, and that. I don't remember seeing the carvings, that, or the things made in wax. No, but, it's like the sculptor Gabriel Cohn. I didn't know he made a bunch of waxes, but I knew his brother, and his brother one day pulled out these dusty little wax things, and you don't know that, this artist has worked this way or that way or experimented. But it's always important, I'm thinking of Bill and Romer now. There's a subject because Ruth Fine is in the room, and I think I mentioned this before, but if I didn't. But there are 2 or 3 collagraphs in the retrospective of Romer. And I remember those collagraphs, or if not those same ones, very similar, in the place on 30th Street. And we were talking, Romy wasn't in the room, and Bill says, Romy doesn't know what he's doing with this. He can't make it, so I have to show him how to make the collograph, It's a special process. It's simple once you know it, but if you don't, you don't. And most of us know our main structure or process, and then the others, we could use some help from time to time. But nobody ever says, oh, the collagraphs were a relationship between Bill Majors and Romer, but they are. I know it because I was there, At the same time, because I spent a lot of time, in fact, my first real New York printmaking experiences were with Bob Blackburn, and of course Bob and Romer were very close, in that. Yeah. And what you find, because they somehow, I can't remember how they got me introduced to Ben Wigfall, but the only print that's a complete collaboration between Jane Cortez and me was with Wigfall in, up there, because he was trying to develop a situation for the community there in Kingston, It worked for a few years. I think he called it Communications Village. And somewhere I have a full newspaper documentation of that. And what I'm getting at is Bill or Romer or Bob Blackburn, Alan here, of course, and others have made an attempt to reach out to others. Recently, the museums are deciding that the works that I did in the 70s using barbed wire are significant. But with Wigfall, I made a print or several prints that used the barbed wire as the line drawing part. And then Jane's writing went between the lines, so it was like a page, if you will. Well, that was a collaboration between an artist and writer. Well, if you read the writing in the portfolio book of Bill's, that's as informative as anybody needs in relation to what printmaking could be. You know, I mean, at least that's my opinion. Plus, the theme, Ecclesiastes, is a multi-directional sort of what is the human predicament, you know. And if anybody was concerned about it, it was Bill. And he talked about his youth. He talked about his growing up in Indianapolis in ways that well, they were similar to mine, but all of us had different experiences, but we could come together. And Bill had a place to bring us together. You know, I probably have wandered off a bit on your question in terms of technique, but or other things, but I'm going to go way off real quick.
Good.
The last meeting of, I don't know if it was a meeting, but a party for Spiral at Romare Bearden's loft. And so I wasn't a member because I was just a recent arrival in New York. And, you know, the wine flowed, the gin flowed, the food flowed, and we laughed and talked a lot. But also there was a classic argument. Reggie Gammon,
I was
Bill
there.
Gunn, some kind of argument. I don't know what it was, what really sparked it. But you never heard, this was the best bad language you ever heard thrown at each other. This was a nice civil get-together, you know. And so, who went downstairs? Bill went downstairs, walked down a level where Romare kept his weightlifting stuff and threatened Reggie to come on downstairs because I got some steel for you. Say, is that art? Well, that's a part of the relationships we had. Of course, it didn't turn anything more than that. And now it's a legend, and I'm talking about 50 years later. And you say, well, what does that have to do with gum and, you know, scratching plates and stuff like that? It takes a human personality. And Bill he wasn't how you say, he had real strong opinions, you know. And four-letter English, hey, very good, you know, and I do too, so I know it, you know. But he and I never seemed to have a conflict, you know. It tended to be that we reassured each other in times and circumstances, you know. And I don't know, it just was, well, I'll testify about Bill for a long time, so give me another,
Yes,